Hello everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we travel back to a world thick with smoke, fear, and the sound of church bells tolling far too often. The year is 1348, and a shadow is crawling across Europe. It creeps down trade routes, slips through city gates, and settles into every crack of human life. They call it the Great Mortality, or simply the Pestilence. Later, we would name it the Black Death. But back then, it was just the end of everything familiar. Cities that had once pulsed with promise, London, Florence, Paris, had become their own kind of trap. Crowded, noisy, and filthy. They offered no protection against the invisible killer. Narrow streets overflowed with waste, animals, and people pressed shoulder to shoulder. Rats thrived there, living off the scraps of a civilization that believed itself too grand to fall. Fleas found their paradise in wool, fur, and sweat. One bite, and the clock started ticking. At first, no one could make sense of it. Was it a curse? Bad air? Divine punishment? Doctors in long-beaked masks wandered the streets, clutching herbs against their noses, convinced sweet smells could block evil vapors. Prius sprayed. Astrologers pointed to the stars. Nothing worked. By the time a city realized it was infected, it was already too late. Inside the walls, panic spread faster than the plague. People nailed their doors shut from the inside, hoping to seal out death. Others fled in carts and carriages, unknowingly carrying infection with them. Markets emptied, schools closed, and silence fell where laughter used to live. At night, the wheels of death carts echoed through empty streets, calling out for bodies to be collected. The living stopped counting. Yet far from the chaos, in the quiet folds of the countryside, life moved differently. A farmer in a remote valley could work the fields and hear nothing but wind and water. There were no crowds, no markets, no passing ships. The air was cold and clean. Fewer rats, fewer fleas, fewer chances. Out here, survival was not science, it was isolation. The same loneliness that weighed on the rural poor suddenly became their greatest advantage. Isolation was not glamorous, it was brutal. A single accident, a bad harvest, or a wolf at the door could undo everything. But when the plague came, those who lived far from trade routes found themselves protected by distance itself. Villages perched on hills or tucked in forests often reported fewer deaths. In places where the plague reached late, people had already heard the rumors, so they locked their doors, closed their churches, and waited. One of the strangest stories of that time comes from the monasteries. Long before quarantine was a word, monks were already practicing it without knowing. Many religious orders lived under strict isolation, sleeping in single cells, eating alone, keeping silence. They were not hiding from disease. They were obeying rules of faith. But their discipline accidentally became the best defense system in medieval Europe. The Carthusian order, for example, lived high in the mountains, far from the bustle of towns. They grew their own food, drank their own water, and spoke only when necessary. When the plague spread below, they simply kept their rhythm, prayers, gardening, copying manuscripts, resting, repeating. For months, some monasteries escaped untouched, while entire cities crumbled. They had no idea that the habits that kept their souls clean were also saving their bodies. Not all were spared, of course. Many monks broke isolation to serve the sick, carrying last rites into infected homes. Some became martyrs of compassion. But in every case, the pattern held true. Routine, order, and distance were stronger than superstition or wealth. It was not the noble or the powerful who lasted, it was the disciplined and the quiet. Meanwhile, in the cities, connection itself became deadly. A merchant shouting prices at the market, a midwife tending to births, a priest offering communion, all became unknowing couriers of death. The same trade routes that brought spices, silk, and stories from distant lands now delivered disease. Ships docked in harbours with goods and corpses aboard. Fleas jumped from rats to sailors to dock workers, and from there into the veins of entire nations. Florence, one of the most cultured cities of the time, saw perhaps 100,000 people die in a matter of months. Chroniclers describe dogs wandering empty streets, houses abandoned with meals still on tables. In London, corpses were buried in mass pits so vast that gravediggers lost count. The Pope ordered fires to burn day and night in hopes of cleansing the air. Paris physicians prescribed bloodletting, potions, and crushed emeralds. None of it mattered. And yet, among the chaos, patterns began to emerge. The rich who fled early had the best odds. The ones who stayed behind often died. Families who shut themselves in quickly, who refused visitors, sometimes made it through. A locked door became more powerful than any prayer. In some places, people began to copy what worked. Fewer guests, smaller circles, less movement. The idea was primitive, but effective. If you do not see people, you do not die with them. Some towns tried collective measures. A few banned public gatherings, markets, and religious processions. Venice, desperate and terrified, began to isolate arriving ships for 40 days. 40 giorni, the root of the word quarantine. It was one of the first organized public health measures in history, and it came not from knowledge, but from fear and pattern recognition. They saw what happened when they did not isolate and chose caution instead. Meanwhile, in the countryside, survival depended on self-sufficiency. People stored grain high above the floor to keep rats away. They cleaned their homes, burned waste, and relied on cats for pest control, though superstitions sometimes backfired. In some cities, cats were killed for being agents of the devil, which only let rat populations explode further. The irony was cruel. Fear of the wrong enemy invited the real one closer. The contrast between city and countryside could not have been sharper. In towns, bells rang constantly for funerals. In distant farms, you could go weeks without hearing a word of news. In one place, people drowned in rumors and fear. In the other, they waited, suspicious and silent, until the danger passed. By the time the worst was over, something strange had happened. The survivors were not necessarily the strongest or the most devout. They were often the most withdrawn. They had mastered a skill we rarely praise: staying still. Their world had demanded action, movement, ambition, but the plague punished those instincts. To live, you had to resist them. Centuries later, historians would look back and realize how geography and simplicity saved millions. Cities like London, Florence, and Avignon suffered catastrophic losses. Isolated mountain villages sometimes escaped almost untouched. The patterns were not random. They told a story that still feels eerily familiar. When danger moves faster than understanding, distance becomes wisdom. It is easy now, with hindsight, to say who should have left and who should have stayed. But imagine yourself there, no signs, no maps, no cure, just choices. Do you leave the city, not knowing if you will starve on the road? Do you stay inside, listening to the silence outside your window, praying you do not cough tomorrow? Every decision carried weight. And yet, in the quiet corners of Europe, where people closed their doors early and waited long after the worst had passed, life slowly returned. Fields were ploughed again. Candles burned in windows. Bells began to ring for weddings instead of funerals. Out of that silence, a new rhythm was born, a slower, more cautious kind of living. So, if you ever wonder what it really took to survive the Black Death, it was not bravery or brilliance. It was the courage to withdraw, to live small, to wait. The plague favored those who could resist their instincts to trade, to gather, to run, and instead choose stillness. In that sense, the survivors of 1348 left us more than stories of fear. They left a blueprint, a reminder that sometimes the safest place to be is far from the noise, listening to the wind, while the world below forgets how to breathe. When the plague first arrived, no one could explain how it spread, but patterns began to whisper their own logic. People started noticing that those who stayed home, who avoided strangers and markets, somehow survived longer. They did not call it social distancing. They called it locking the door. And that small, fearful act, closing yourself off, became one of the only decisions that mattered. At the beginning, it seemed cruel. Turning away visitors, refusing to open for neighbors, ignoring a friend's knock, all of it felt like betrayal. Communities built on trust were suddenly ruled by suspicion. A cough at the gate could end a family. So the ones who lasted were the ones who learned to hesitate, even when their hearts ached to help. There is a story from Florence about a merchant who barred his home before the pestilence reached his street. He stored weeks of grain, sealed windows with wax, and refused to let anyone in or out, not even his brother. The neighbors mocked him for being paranoid, but as days passed and funerals multiplied, mockery turned into envy. When the plague finally burned out, his family was still alive. The brother who laughed at him was not. It was brutal wisdom, the kind that felt unholy to practice but impossible to deny. Staying apart became the most human act of care because contact was deadly. Parents stopped kissing their children goodnight. Lovers stopped meeting in alleys. Priests refused to touch the dying. Even prayer changed. Confessions were shouted through doors. Last rites whispered from a distance. Inside each home, fear built its own routines. People divided chores by risk. One person left food at the doorstep. Another fetched water before dawn when the streets were empty. Meals were simple, shared in silence. The sound of coughing next door became a warning to hold your breath. Whole streets turned into islands, families hiding behind wooden barricades as if from a siege. But the ones who shut their doors early, who did it before panic spread, had the best odds. They did not wait to see proof. They moved faster than comfort allowed. While others argued about causes, they built walls of absence. Those early decisions, made in silence, drew the line between life and death. Still, not everyone had that choice. The poor could not afford isolation. They lived 6 or 10 to a room, working daily just to eat. Their jobs, hauling, selling, serving, meant constant exposure. Some fled the cities, but most were trapped inside them. For them, stay home was not advice. It was impossible. They watched the rich escape behind country gates, while they faced death at the markets and wells. Survival became a kind of lottery, unfair and unrelenting. And then there were those who refused to hide, who moved toward danger out of faith or duty. Doctors, priests, gravediggers, some driven by belief, others by need. They became both heroes and victims, their courage measured in days lived. One chronicler wrote that he stopped counting the dead after his ink ran out. Another said he could not write names fast enough before the next day's list arrived. Still, through all the despair, some began to see a strange pattern in the silence. When crowds disappeared, infection slowed. When roads emptied, the air seemed cleaner, the nights quieter. It was not divine mercy. It was math. Fewer hands meant fewer fleas. Fewer meetings meant fewer burials. People began to act on instinct before science could explain why it worked. In some places, whole villages closed themselves off completely. Gates were locked, bridges blocked, paths hidden. Anyone who tried to enter was turned away, sometimes by force. Harsh, but effective. There are records of mountain towns in Italy and Switzerland that survived almost untouched, simply because they cut contact early and never reopened until months after the cities were ash. A famous example is the small English village of Iam. Decades later, during another plague, when the disease arrived, they chose to quarantine themselves entirely to stop it spreading beyond their borders. It cost hundreds of lives inside the village, but it saved countless others outside it. Their isolation became a legend of sacrifice. The lesson, though harsh, echoed what survivors of the Black Death had already known. Distance saves, even when it hurts. Inside isolated homes, days blurred. People marked time by candle stubs and the slow rhythm of waiting. Some prayed constantly, others sat in silence, listening for the faintest noise outside, a bell, a cough, a cart. Isolation was its own sickness, breeding anxiety and strange dreams. But those who could endure it, who learned to make peace with solitude, were the ones who saw the world return. And something shifted deep inside human behavior. After the plague, people understood in their bones that crowds could kill. The survivors did not trust the marketplace as they once did. They built homes farther apart, widened streets, and left space between doorways. Even festivals changed. The memory of contagion haunted every gathering. What we now call public health began not from doctors, but from ordinary people learning to stay away. That instinct of retreat, of stillness, was not cowardice. It was adaptation. When the invisible world becomes lethal, courage is measured not by who fights, but by who can wait. The merchant behind his locked door, the mother who stops her children from playing outside, the monk who prays alone in his cell, all were early architects of survival. Looking back, it is almost poetic. The plague did not just kill bodies. It rewrote habits. It taught people to fear touch, to see silence as safety, and solitude as mercy. And in that long winter of isolation, humanity discovered something new. Sometimes the greatest act of love is to stay away. The way people dressed in the 14th century was more than just a matter of pride or status. It was a matter of life and death. Before the plague, clothing was a symbol of hierarchy. The rich draped themselves in heavy velvet, fur-lined cloaks, and ornate layers of wool that showed their wealth. The poor wore rougher fabric, patched linen, or coarse hemp. No one thought about fleas. Why would they? They were invisible, insignificant. Yet those tiny creatures hid in every fold of luxury. In the crowded streets of Florence and London, people wore their status like armor. But in the face of the plague, that armor turned against them. Thick fabrics trapped warmth and sweat, perfect conditions for fleas to thrive. The plague did not care about class, but clothing gave it a map. More layers, more hiding places, more bites. Wealthy homes with carpets, furs, and feather mattresses became silent feeding grounds. Even the doctor's famous beaked robe, designed to protect him, often carried the very insects he feared. Contrast that with the countryside. Peasants wore little more than light linen tunics, washed by rivers and dried in sunlight. Their clothes were simple, their living quarters sparse, their beds made of straw, replaced each season. Fleas had fewer places to hide. Cleanliness was not intentional hygiene, it was born of necessity. The poor could not afford excess, and in that simplicity lay accidental wisdom. There is something deeply ironic about it. The people least equipped to understand the science of disease sometimes lived through it best because they owned less. Poverty forced habits that happened to protect them, washing garments by hand, drying them in wind, sleeping near smoke, avoiding ornate decor that harbored pests. Meanwhile, the upper class, wrapped in brocade and fur, met their ends surrounded by the trappings of status. And then there were the plague doctors, now so iconic in paintings. The long black coats, gloves, boots, and bird-like masks stuffed with herbs were meant to filter bad air. They looked terrifying, and they were. Many wore the same outfit from house to house without ever washing it. The thick leather, thought to protect them, actually carried fleas in its seams. Every visit to a dying patient became a game of chance, every breath a roll of fate. Not that anyone knew. People blamed miasma, the foul air thought to carry disease. The smell of rot and decay seemed logical proof, so they countered it with perfume, incense, and flowers. They filled their masks and pockets with lavender, rosemary, or crushed petals, believing sweet scents could repel sickness. In a way, they were not entirely wrong. Some herbs did drive away insects, and the pungent smell sometimes made others keep their distance. Social avoidance disguised as superstition, another accidental layer of safety. But not all customs helped. Fashion also meant wigs powdered with flour, hats decorated with feathers, long cloaks dragging through dirty streets, all of which collected vermin like trophies. Tailors stitched new garments from infested fabric. Traders sold second-hand clothes stripped from the dead. Flea eggs could lie dormant for days, waiting for warmth. In buying a robe or cloak, you could be buying your own death sentence. The few who began to notice patterns changed habits quietly. Some started wearing shorter sleeves, simpler garments, and lighter colors that made insects easier to spot. Linen replaced fur. Homes that could afford it began washing bedding in boiling water, hanging it over smoke or in the sun. Monks in disciplined orders boiled their robes weekly, partly as ritual purification, unknowingly creating early pest control. These small adjustments saved lives in silence, uncelebrated but crucial. There is an image that often haunts the imagination, a noble woman, her dress magnificent and heavy, walking through her courtyard while her servants keep their distance. Beneath her gown, fleas shift like embers in cloth. She does not see them. She does not even know such danger exists. Her beauty, her wealth, her silk, all glowing in the afternoon sun, are already sealing her fate. Meanwhile, in a nearby field, a farm girl in plain linen bends over the soil, sweat on her brow, air in her lungs, still alive when her betters are gone. Fashion, like pride, became punishment. The layers meant to separate rich from poor only drew them closer to death. When the survivors rebuilt society, clothing quietly changed. Simplicity gained respect. Linen became more common. Fur went briefly out of favor. People started to equate excess with danger, even if they could not explain why. The lesson was not written in books, it was worn on bodies. In the years that followed, small signs of this shift appeared everywhere. Laws once designed to restrict lower classes from wearing fine clothes, the sumptuary laws lost their power. They had been meaningless during the plague, when death ignored dress codes. For a time, people seemed to understand that fabric could not separate them from fate. Survival favored those who could shed pretense and layers. The irony is hard to miss. A civilization obsessed with appearances discovered that humility could save it. The same idea repeats through history. In quieter forms, the soldier who polishes his armor but forgets to eat. The empire that builds gold temples while its people starve. The Black Death just made the point brutally clear. When danger comes unseen, excess only slows your escape. By the end of the plague years, those who lived knew something profound without ever naming it. They had learned, through loss and luck, that survival often belongs to the simplest habits, the ones too plain to boast about. Wash your clothes. Hang them in the sun. Keep your distance. Do not chase vanity when silence might save you. In the age of velvet and pride, the ones who endured were the ones who looked ordinary. And so, the story of medieval fashion is not just about what people wore. It is about how the smallest, most innocent choices, a cloak too thick, a sleeve too long, could decide everything. A reminder that, in times of crisis, the difference between danger and safety can be as thin as a single layer of cloth. When the world was falling apart, some people did not need medicine or miracles, they just needed altitude. Hagiography quietly became destiny during the Black Death. The higher you lived, the better your chances. The disease spread fastest where people gathered most, dense, damp cities with heavy air and slow wind. But the wind was everything. In the mountains, it blew clean and constant. It carried away the smells of rot, the fleas that clung to clothes, and the fear that lived in crowds. In the lowlands, cities like Venice, Marseille, and London suffocated under their own density. Rivers that once brought trade and prosperity turned against them. Their waters ran with waste and corpses. Rats multiplied along the docks, slipping from ship to shore unnoticed. Every crate, every bale of wool became a small Trojan horse, hiding death in its fibers. Merchants kept the ports open. As long as they could trade meant survival, but it also meant exposure. When the rats came off the boats, they did not stay by the water. They climbed the hills and followed the roads. But altitude slowed them. Many highland villages in the Alps, the Pyrenees, or the Scottish Highlands escaped the plague for months. some entirely. Thin air, cold nights, sparse trade, all became invisible barriers. People there were used to isolation. Their world already ran on patience and routine. They did not travel far, did not see many strangers, and did not trust the lowland markets anyway. When the plague spread below, they simply waited it out above. There are records of shepherds in the mountains who had no idea what had happened until years later. They came down in spring expecting to find familiar faces, only to discover empty villages and silence. It must have felt like waking from a dream into another world, the same earth, but no one left to share it. They were survivors, not by intellect, but by geography. Even within cities, the same pattern repeated. People who lived on hillsides or in the upper quarters fared better than those near rivers or markets. The poor, crowded into the lowest parts of towns, suffered the most. They were closer to the rats, to the garbage, to the bodies piled for burial. The higher districts, breezier and cleaner, unknowingly enjoyed an advantage that had nothing to do with faith or fortune. In Florence, the wealthy families who fled to their villas in the hills survived in far greater numbers. It was not because of medicine, it was the air. Boccaccio's Decameron begins with this very image, a group of young people leaving the plague-stricken city to tell stories in the countryside. They were characters in fiction, but the habit was real. The hills above Florence were filled with escapees who spent months hiding among olive groves, listening to the faint echo of church bells below. Elevation did what no priest or doctor could. Cold air killed fleas. Distance thinned infection. Mountain villages with fresh water, low humidity, and few visitors became fortresses of health. Some remote monasteries on cliffs and ridges remained untouched, their isolation turning from spiritual to physical protection. A wall of stone was one kind of defense. 1,000 feet of elevation was another. But height was not just physical, it was symbolic. To rise above the city was to rise above its chaos. People began to see altitude as purity. The mountain became a metaphor for safety, for the clean, untouchable sky. Pilgrims started to seek higher ground, not just for prayer, but for survival. The idea that evil came from below, from swamps and filth and low places, began to shape how people thought about disease itself. Centuries later, this belief evolved into something surprisingly close to science. When physicians of the Renaissance studied plague patterns, they noticed how low, humid environments fared worse. The theory of bad air miasma came from this observation. They were not entirely wrong. They blamed the smell of decay, thinking it carried sickness, but what they were really noticing was the ecology of rats and fleas. Their instincts were right, even when their explanations were not. The cities that learned from this changed their architecture. They widened streets to let air move freely. They built homes with windows facing the wind. They drained swamps, paved roads, and cleared garbage pits. All of it came from the memory that stagnant air meant death. Geography became a teacher, and people finally started to listen. It is strange to think how something as simple as a hill could decide your fate. But in the 14th century, every advantage counted. A few hundred feet could mean the difference between breathing clean air and inhaling the invisible dust of decay. People who understood this, even without words for it, began to move differently. Merchants built summer houses on ridges, farmers dug wells farther from rivers. Towns planned walls around wind currents. The land itself began to shape survival. Of course, not everyone could escape upward. Many were trapped in valleys, in tenements, in marshy towns with no option but prayer. Some tried to flee too late, following the plague instead of outrunning it. There are letters from that time describing lines of refugees climbing mountain passes only to be turned away by armed guards from untouched villages. Fear closed doors faster than compassion. The mountains protected their people, but they also hardened them. Still, for those who made it, the lesson lasted. In the decades that followed, survivors rebuilt higher and smaller. Churches appeared on hilltops, towns shifted inland, and new settlements favored altitude over access. It was as if Europe collectively decided to breathe deeper. And maybe that is what the plague taught them most, that survival does not always belong to the strongest, but to those who learn where the wind still moves. From then on, height became hope. The lowlands remembered death, the mountains remembered silence, and between them stretched the story of how geography, simple, silent geography, saved more lives than all the kings, doctors, and prayers combined. In the medieval world, cleanliness was tangled in superstition. People did not wash often, not because they loved filth, but because they feared water. Physicians warned that bathing opened the pores to bad air. Priests cautioned that vanity in the bath could tempt sin. And in the cold stone cities of Europe, clean water was hard to find anyway. Most wells were contaminated. Most rivers doubled as sewers. To bathe was a risk not of drowning, but of disease. Ironically, that fear of illness through water made illness through filth far worse. Yet even in the dark confusion of the 14th century, some people stumbled into the truth. They noticed that those who stayed cleaner, those who washed their hands before eating, boiled their linens, or aired their rooms, fell sick less often. No one knew about bacteria or parasites, but observation had its own power. Monks who followed strict washing rituals before prayer often survived longer than lay people. Their purification rites were really hygiene disguised as devotion. For most, however, the line between remedy and ritual was blurred. Some soaked their clothes in vinegar, believing it warded off bad spirits. Others filled their homes with smoke from burning herbs or pine resin to chase out evil vapors. These methods half worked for reasons no one understood. Smoke killed some fleas. Vinegar repelled rodents. But their success fed false logic. People thought they were fighting demons when they were really fumigating insects. Water, paradoxically, became both medicine and poison. Bathhouses had once been social centers, places of warmth, gossip, and comfort, but when the plague came, they shut down. The disease spread too easily in enclosed steam rooms through shared towels and close contact. Soon, public bathing was seen as dangerous, even immoral. Cities abandoned them. Centuries of progress in sanitation dissolved in fear. Europe would not rediscover regular bathing until long after the Renaissance. Still, within private homes, small acts of cleanliness persisted. Housewives scrubbed doorsteps with lye, believing it would keep out misfortune. Farmers burned old straw bedding after each season, unknowingly killing plague fleas in the process. People who changed their clothes, often a rare luxury, then tended to live longer. When physicians advised washing with rosewater or wine, they were not purifying the soul. They were disinfecting wounds without realizing it. One of the strangest contradictions of the age was that the poor, often labeled dirty, sometimes survived better simply because they had less to keep filthy. Their homes were small, their possessions few, and their lives mostly outdoors. The wind aired their spaces, the sun baked their walls. Meanwhile, the wealthy layered perfumes over decay, hiding danger under fragrance. Their marble floors gleamed, but their mattresses crawled with life they could not see. Superstitions ran wild. Some believed that sweet smells could purify the air, so they stuffed pomanders with spices and wore them on chains around their necks. Doctors walked with long-beaked masks filled with mint and cloves, certain it would protect them from infection. Others claimed loud noises could scatter the disease, so church bells rang day and night, cannons fired in cities, and prayers were shouted from rooftops. The sound was constant, the fear louder still. The truth, hidden beneath layers of myth, was simple. The clean survived. Not perfectly, not always, but measurably. In towns where people began washing streets with lime or vinegar, infection rates dropped. In villages where waste was buried far from homes, fewer rats gathered. What began as superstition evolved slowly into practice, a new awareness that dirt was not just a sign of poverty, it was a symptom of danger. After the worst years, the survivors rebuilt with this half-knowledge. They widened streets to let light in, built sewers to carry filth away, and designed public fountains fed by fresh aqueducts. Bathhouses returned, slowly and cautiously. The wealthy began to see cleanliness as a virtue instead of a vice. It was not about luxury anymore, it was about safety. But it took centuries for this shift to take root. For generations after the Black Death, people still whispered that washing too much weakened the body. Some nobles bathed only a few times a year, covering the rest with powder and perfume. The memory of disease was long, but its lessons were learned unevenly. Looking back, hygiene in the medieval age was a story of accidents, people stumbling into wisdom without science. A monk boiling his robe in obedience to ritual was performing one of the first acts of infection control. A housewife washing her floor with vinegar was creating one of the earliest disinfectants. A farmer burning straw was practicing pest management centuries before the word existed. They did not know why it worked, but they saw that it worked, and in the end, that was enough. The plague turned superstition into a kind of crude science. Through fear and repetition, through the grim experiment of trial and error, people began to realize that death had patterns. The closer you lived to filth, the sooner you met it. Clean air, clean water, clean hands, these became talismans stronger than any prayer. And in the quiet that followed the Black Death, when survivors looked out over empty fields and silent towns, they carried one simple truth forward. Purity is not just moral, it is mortal. Cleanliness might not save the soul, but it could save the body. And in an age when half the world had vanished, that small truth was enough to start building the next one. If hygiene was shaped by fear, medicine was shaped by confusion. Medieval doctors were confident, learned men fluent in Latin, rich in robes, and completely wrong. The great minds of the 14th century studied Aristotle and Galen as if they were gospel. Disease, they believed, came from imbalances of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. When those fluids fell out of harmony, the body rebelled. Their cure, bleeding, purging, or prayer, sometimes all three. When the plague struck, medicine met its match. People wanted explanations. Priests blamed sin, astrologers blamed the planets, doctors blamed bad air. Each answer comforted someone, but none saved anyone. Physicians advised carrying flowers, burning incense, or rubbing chopped onions under your arms. Some prescribed crushed emeralds mixed with wine. Others recommended sitting near fire to sweat out the poison which only made the fleas hungrier. There were no hospitals as we imagine them. There were sick rooms, crowded, dark, filled with moaning bodies and the smell of rot. Doctors wore long coats and bird-beaked masks stuffed with herbs to filter the air. They walked from patient to patient with wooden sticks, poking and prodding from a distance. In their eyes, the beak protected them. In reality, it made them walking hosts for plague-bearing fleas. Many died within weeks of their first house call, but they did not stop trying. People desperate for cures turned to whatever seemed to work for someone else. Folk healers mixed potions of garlic, honey, or vinegar. Monks brewed herbal teas that soothed the fevered. Barbers, doubling as surgeons, drained blood from wrists and necks to balance the humours. Some even drilled holes into skulls to let the evil vapours escape. None of it addressed the real cause, a microscopic bacterium carried by fleas, but the gestures gave people a sense of control in a world gone mad. Ironically, the people who distrusted doctors sometimes lived longer. Midwives, herbalists, and caregivers who emphasized cleanliness, changing linens, washing wounds, burning infected bedding, unknowingly practiced the first forms of antiseptic care. They had no degrees, only intuition and patience. Their tools were vinegar, salt, and boiled cloth. In the worst moments, those small acts mattered more than any university lecture. Meanwhile, the educated physicians clung to theory. They debated endlessly whether plague spread through the stars or through air. The word contagion existed, but few believed it. When some doctors proposed isolation or quarantine, others mocked them as cowards. Still, the cities that listened, like Venice, which in 1348 established the first quarantine port, saw the tide slow. Ships were held for 40 days before docking, the origin of the word quarantina. From that one fearful policy, modern public health began. But superstition still ruled the streets. When a physician could not cure, people looked for someone to blame. Jews were accused of poisoning wells. Sinful women were said to bring God's wrath. Astrologers drew charts predicting the next wave. It was science and faith tangled into one desperate chorus, everyone reaching for reason in the dark. In the middle of that chaos, the plague doctor became both a symbol and a warning. His beaked mask terrifying then, theatrical now represented the limits of knowledge. He carried posies in his nose, a cane to keep distance, and faith in theories that never worked. But behind that absurd costume was something tragically human, the need to do something, even when the world no longer made sense. Some treatments bordered on madness. People lit bonfires in their homes to burn away disease. Others lived in total darkness, convinced that light carried death. There were diets of boiled snakes, drinks of mercury, even instructions to sit between fires for days to purify the lungs. The bravest advice came from doctors who suggested flee early, go far, and return late. In other words, run for your life. Yet for all their mistakes, those physicians gave us something we still inherit: documentation. They wrote down symptoms, patterns, and failures. They described buboes, fevers, the speed of death. They compared cities, climates, and cures. Without their notes, we would know far less about how the plague moved or how people fought it. Their ignorance preserved our history. When the worst years ended, Europe had changed not just in numbers but in mind. The plague cracked open faith in ancient authorities. People began questioning Galen, questioning the church, questioning why the educated died alongside the poor. The seeds of modern science were planted in the ashes of that failure. Medicine would never again belong entirely to priests or philosophers. It is easy to mock medieval doctors, the leeches, the masks, the magic stones, but they were doing what humans always do in crisis, reaching for patterns in the dark. They were wrong, yes, but their persistence built the path toward being right. Every absurd remedy, every failed cure, every scribbled note was a step toward understanding the invisible. In a sense, that is the real cure the plague gave humanity: humility. The recognition that knowledge can die just as easily as people, that the world is wider than our theories, and that even the smartest men, dressed in robes and masks, can stand before death and admit, finally, we do not know. From that silence, medicine slowly began to change from superstition to study, from ritual to research, and all of it began with the mistakes of those who tried to save a world that was already on fire. While the cities rotted and the doctors bled patients dry, a few quiet places in Europe barely felt the plague at all. They were not lucky by chance, they were built for solitude. Monasteries, especially those belonging to closed or silent orders like the Carthusians, had already mastered what the rest of the world was just beginning to discover. Isolation saves lives. Far from the noise of the towns, tucked into forests or perched on cliffs, these communities lived according to strict rhythms: prayer, work, and silence. They woke before dawn, shared modest meals, and avoided contact with outsiders, not by design for safety, but for devotion. And when the plague came, their vows of silence turned into a shield stronger than any medicine. Their rules, originally spiritual, doubled as survival manuals. Shared tools were cleaned carefully. Meals were taken in small groups or alone. Visiting strangers was forbidden. Their gardens fed them. Their wells sustained them. They did not need markets, taverns, or trade routes, all of which were highways for death. Some monasteries even maintained their own burial grounds, meaning they never had to send the dead to crowded city pits. In their stillness, they became invisible to the disease. It was not perfect. Not every monk survived. Some, driven by faith and compassion, left their walls to care for the dying. They went into cities carrying food and prayer, often returning only as bodies. Others stayed behind, praying for the souls of those already lost. A few wrote about the silence that followed, how their chants echoed through empty halls, how the bells rang over untouched valleys. Their survival stories sound almost otherworldly, but they reveal something simple. Structure protected them. Inside those stone walls, discipline replaced chaos. While townspeople fled in panic, monks followed a routine that left little room for contagion. They washed regularly, not from belief in hygiene but from ritual purity. They grew herbs, sage, thyme, lavender for medicines that happened to repel fleas. They ate plain food, drank clean water, and avoided the feasts that turned urban gatherings into outbreaks. Their obedience to rule became accidental science. Imagine a monk sitting in his narrow cell, copying scripture while the world outside collapses. The quill scratches on parchment. The air smells faintly of wax and earth. He has no idea that his isolation is saving him. To him, it is penance, not prevention. Yet his order will outlast empires. When the plague finally ebbs, monasteries like his will emerge as some of the few places left standing, quiet islands in a drowned continent. Even among these survivors, humility remained. Many wrote that their safety was divine mercy, not human design. But modern historians reading their records can see the pattern clearly: reduced contact, controlled environment, and a community that enforced it without argument. The first real quarantines in Europe were not declared by governments. They were lived by monks. In Venice, later on, officials would formalize the idea: 40 days of isolation for arriving ships, 40 giorni. But centuries before that, cloistered monasteries were already proving the concept through faith. They had no need to flee because they had never crowded in. There is a subtle beauty in that. The same traits that made monastic life hard, its solitude, silence, and discipline, also made it safe. In an age obsessed with noise and excess, the monks had chosen simplicity and patience. Without knowing it, they were modeling the behavior that would one day be called public health. Some of those quiet survivors did more than endure. They documented. They wrote about the towns that sent no word, the fields left untilled, the families that vanished. They recorded births and deaths, prayers and names. Their manuscripts became the memory of Europe, preserving what entire cities forgot. The Black Death did not just shape medicine, it shaped history through the hands of those who were absent from the worst of it. After the plague, monasteries became sanctuaries for orphans and refugees. Their walls filled again, this time with people seeking peace rather than penance. The monks taught them to farm, to heal, to live simply. The same isolation that had saved them now became a form of service. And when later epidemics came cholera, typhus, smallpox, the idea of quarantine carried their imprint. Stay apart. Stay clean. Stay faithful to the rhythm that keeps you alive. It is strange how wisdom hides in obedience. The monks did not invent quarantine to be clever. They simply followed their vows. But their lives proved something science would take centuries to articulate, that health begins with boundaries. In a way, their solitude became a mirror for humanity itself. The plague taught everyone what the monks had known all along, that sometimes survival depends on stillness. While the world raged and panicked, they listened to the quiet. And in that quiet, they lived. When the Black Death came, your job could quietly decide your fate. In a world without medicine, survival depended not only on luck or geography, but on what you did for a living, where you stood, who you met, how often you touched others. Occupation was destiny. The city's busiest workers were the first to fall. Merchants, innkeepers, butchers, and barbers all handled goods or people daily. The plague spread through touch, trade, and air. Their livelihoods required all three. A merchant might exchange a coin for bread, never realizing the flea that hitched a ride on the baker's sleeve would end his family. A barber, practicing medicine on the side, bled one infected man and carried the same knife to another. The marketplace, once the heartbeat of community life, became its coffin. Messengers were among the most tragic. They moved between towns, delivering letters, orders, and news. In an age without newspapers, they were the nervous system of Europe, and the plague rode through their veins. Some carried the disease across entire kingdoms before realizing what they brought. The faster you worked, the quicker you spread death. Yet in strange contrast, the still and the solitary endured. Shepherds on far hills, fishermen on quiet coasts, and woodcutters deep in forests, these people lived lives already apart from society. Their labor demanded silence, distance, and patience. The shepherd tended only sheep. The fishermen met only the sea. They were poor and lonely, but the plague passed over them like wind over water. Even among city dwellers, solitude became a strange kind of power. Bakers who worked through the night and avoided daytime crowds survived more often than traders or innkeepers. Grave diggers, though surrounded by death, fared surprisingly well, perhaps because constant exposure to the dead meant fewer interactions with the living. Some wore vinegar-soaked rags around their faces, an act of self-preservation mistaken for reverence. Religious roles showed the sharpest contrast. Priests who tended to the sick often died early, while reclusive monks and hermits survived behind monastery walls. The same church that called people to gather for prayer also sent others to their deaths by blessing the infected. Devotion was both weapon and weakness. One of the most dangerous jobs was waste collection. Nightmen, as they were called in some cities, hauled away garbage, sewage, and sometimes bodies under cover of darkness. They lived short lives even before the plague, but during the outbreak they became indispensable. Cities could not bury their dead without them. Many died in days, but others, through constant exposure and rough immunity, lived to see the aftermath. Their work was horror, yet necessary a reminder that civilization rests on those willing to touch what others will not. Then there were the travelers, pilgrims, soldiers, and sailors. All carried faith or duty, but also infection. Pilgrims moved between shrines, kissing relics, praying in crowds. Soldiers shared cramped tents, their wounds inviting infection. Sailors, trapped on ships infested with rats, carried the plague across borders. Ports became death traps, their harbors filled with ships whose crews had already died. Those vessels drifted silently to shore, their cargo now a weapon. But the plague also birthed new occupations. Watchers were hired to guard the doors of infected houses, ensuring no one entered or escaped. Searchers inspected corpses and reported deaths to authorities. Pest masters burned contaminated clothing and bedding, often earning more than doctors but living less. Fear itself became an economy, the dead feeding the living. And through it all, the social order cracked. Nobles who once relied on servants found themselves alone. The servants were gone, dead, or fled. Farmers abandoned estates. Laborers demanded higher wages. The plague did not just kill, it redistributed power. When the survivors emerged, they discovered a world where labor suddenly mattered more than lineage. Fields needed hands, not titles. In that way, the plague became a brutal equalizer. It did not care about crowns or robes, but it revealed which lives were built closest to danger. The rich could flee sometimes too late. The poor stayed, worked, and died. But a few, those who already lived far from the noise of trade and touch, carried their small professions into the next century. It is humbling to think how survival could hinge on such ordinary habits. The same shepherd who thought himself invisible to history was, in truth, history's proof of endurance. His job, quiet, patient, remote, became the blueprint for surviving contagion. And the world, though it did not yet know the word epidemiology, began to sense the pattern. Those who moved least lived longest. The plague was not just a test of faith or fortune. It was a test of movement. The ones who labored with their hands far from crowds, who spoke rarely, who worked with nature instead of people, they outlasted kings and scholars. When Europe rebuilt, it was on the backs of those survivors, the invisible professions that never stopped working, even as the world stopped breathing. For centuries after, people would blame witches, strangers, even the stars for the Black Death. The real culprits were far humbler rats and the fleas they carried. Small, silent, and unstoppable, they moved through homes and markets without ever being noticed. And by the time anyone saw them, it was already too late. The medieval home was a perfect haven for them. Stone floors, straw bedding, food scraps left overnight, and warmth from cooking fires. It was a paradise for vermin. Families slept close together, sometimes even with animals for heat. Cats roamed freely, but superstition often turned against them. The church, associating cats, especially black ones, with witchcraft, encouraged their killing. In destroying their best pest control, people unknowingly gave the plague free rein. Rats bred under floorboards, in grain stores, and along the riversides where towns dumped their waste. Fleas fed on them, carrying within their bodies the invisible weapon, Yersinia pestis. When the rat died, the flea jumped to the nearest warm thing, a dog, a child, a priest kneeling at prayer. The infection did not care who you were. It only needed blood. Household habits became lines between life and death. Those who swept often, stored food off the ground, and kept animals outside had better odds. People who cleaned out stables or burned old straw sometimes killed infected fleas without knowing. Even hanging clothes in the sun helped, because heat and light dried the eggs before they hatched. A clean floor was not just tidy, it was tactical. But clean was a rare concept in medieval Europe. Water was precious, soap expensive, and cities overrun with animals. Chickens wandered through kitchens, pigs ate refuse in alleys, and dogs slept beside beds. The air was thick with the smell of rotten smoke. It was normal until death started following it. When the plague came, some households tried desperate measures. People sprinkled vinegar on walls, scattered herbs, or hung garlic from windows. They smoked their homes with sage and sulfur. The richer ones filled rooms with roses and perfumes, trying to sweeten the air. None of it stopped the fleas, but sometimes, by masking scent or driving away rats, it slowed them. The few who noticed patterns began to act differently. A merchant in Lübeck kept cats against church advice. His home survived untouched, while his neighbors perished. In Venice, city officials began killing stray dogs and rats in a bid to purify the air. They had no concept of bacteria, but they were the first to realize the plague had roots in filth. Flea infestations grew so common that people began to accept them as part of life. One chronicler wrote that nobles at banquets often paused mid-speech to scratch, pretending it was thoughtfulness. The constant biting, itching, and scratching was background noise, the hum of an ecosystem no one questioned. And from that quiet discomfort rose an empire of death. In the countryside, rats were fewer but not absent. Barns filled with grain became magnets. Farmers who kept their stores sealed or raised off the ground were safer. Cats and barn owls became unspoken allies. Some farmers began to see animals not as omens but as workers, part of a silent defense network against the plague. Over time, this shaped a slow, invisible shift. People started storing food differently. Cellars were lined with stone. Granaries were sealed tight. Waste was dumped farther from homes. It was not science yet, just memory, the memory of lost teaching behavior. Every surviving family carried small rituals forward. Air the bedding, clean the floor, keep a cat. Ironically, the same church that had once condemned cats began, in later decades, to encourage cleanliness as a virtue. Monasteries led by example, keeping storerooms tidy, burying waste, tending gardens with care. What began as religious order evolved into public health. Still, superstition never vanished. Even as late as the 17th century, during later plague waves, people blamed the air, not the animals. Fleas were too small to be feared. The human mind, it seems, preferred monsters it could see. The story of the rats and fleas is almost too simple for such immense suffering. The plague was not born of sin or magic, just biology. But what it revealed about humanity was profound. We built worlds that comforted us warmth, food, closeness, and in doing so, we built the perfect stage for death. The smallest details of life, where we sleep, what we store, what we fear, became the difference between extinction and endurance. It is humbling, really. Civilization rose and nearly fell because we did not think about what lived beneath our feet. And in the end, when people rebuilt, they did not just raise walls higher. They changed how they lived inside them. They lifted beds off the floor, stored food in sealed jars, cleaned their thresholds, and let cats live again. These habits, born from grief and instinct, would slowly form the foundations of sanitation. It was not knowledge that saved them, it was adaptation. A slow learning written not in books, but in scratches, bites, and small acts of care. The rats moved through our homes, but in their wake, they forced humanity to finally see what home meant, not safety by default, but something we must earn, keep, and protect. One clean floor at a time. As fear spread faster than the plague itself, the cities began to unravel. When no cure worked, when priests died mid-sermon and doctors vanished, people turned their terror toward each other. Every rumor found a target. Every grief needed someone to blame. And in that vacuum of reason, cruelty flourished. In some towns, strangers were hunted on sight. Foreign merchants were accused of carrying cursed goods. In others, beggars were beaten, their sickness taken as proof of sin. But the most tragic scapegoats were the Jewish communities scattered across Europe. When wells turned foul or bodies piled high, mobs whispered that the Jews had poisoned the water. No evidence, no trial, just torches, fear, and rage. Whole neighborhoods were burned. Thousands were killed, not by plague, but by panic. The church condemned these massacres, but often too late. Fear had already rewritten law. Even the idea of foreign air, that disease came from somewhere else, justified closing borders, banning travelers, and isolating villages not just from sickness, but from compassion. Mass processions filled the streets. Barefoot penitents whipping themselves with chains, chanting hymns, begging forgiveness for the world's sins. The flagellants believed that if they suffered enough, God would spare them. They marched from town to town, bleeding and praying, spreading hope and contagion in equal measure. Cities banned them, others joined them. The line between faith and hysteria vanished. Rumors became their own epidemic. People claimed the stars had turned against them, that witches brewed storms of death, that God had abandoned earth. Families barricaded doors, not just against illness, but against neighbors. Anyone who sneezed was shunned. Anyone who buried too many relatives was suspected of witchcraft. Silence grew where friendship used to live. In the countryside, travelers were met at spear point. Villages blocked bridges with wagons and hung signs reading "No entry, death within." Isolation that once meant survival began to mutate into suspicion. Kindness became dangerous. Hospitality fatal. And yet, even amid the madness, small acts of mercy persisted. Some towns organized burial teams to collect the dead with dignity. Others established pest houses for the infected, primitive quarantines that kept families apart but offered a chance at survival. Fear made people cruel, but it also made them inventive. Order tried to reassert itself, even in chaos. Still, the plague left deep scars that outlived its symptoms. When it finally receded, many survivors carried guilt for abandoning loved ones, for running from neighbors, for doing what they had to do to live. They returned to empty streets, ashes, and silence. The faces they blamed were gone, but the shame remained. This is one of the quiet truths of every catastrophe. Panic is its own contagion. It spreads through words, through glances, through desperation. And once it takes hold, reason dies before the body does. The Black Death did not just expose the weakness of medicine, it exposed the fragility of trust. The same fear that should have united people drove them apart. It taught Europe a brutal lesson that would echo for centuries. When the invisible enemy comes, the real battle is not only against death, but against the part of ourselves that looks for someone else to burn. When the plague left no logic standing, people turned to what they could still touch: herbs, charms, and the comforting weight of ritual. Science had failed them. Faith was fraying. And yet the human urge to do something remained. So they improvised cures out of folklore, half-remembered wisdom, and desperate imagination. Garlic was chewed like medicine. Vinegar was drunk by the cup. Some rubbed crushed emeralds on their skin, or carried amulets carved with Latin prayers. Housewives hung rosemary, sage, and bay leaves in doorways. Apothecaries sold sachets of lavender to pin inside coats. Every street smelled like a garden fighting to smother death. And for a moment, it worked not as a cure, but as comfort. Perfumes and flowers became talismans of survival. The wealthy walked with posy rings, small bouquets they held to their faces to block the stench of rot. Children sang nursery rhymes about roses and ashes, unaware they were writing the soundtrack of catastrophe. The plague doctor's beaked mask, stuffed with mint and spices, was just a grander version of the same idea. Keep sweetness near, keep sickness away. In poorer districts, faith and fear fused into stranger customs. People burned herbs under beds, washed walls with wine, or whispered spells while lighting candles. Some wore charms etched with symbols of the planets, believing celestial forces could redirect the poison in the air. Others drew protective circles in chalk around their doors. In a world without explanation, magic filled the gap where science should have been. Yet not all folk remedies were useless. Many herbs, sage, thyme, juniper, truly did repel fleas. Vinegar could disinfect wounds. Garlic strengthened breath and appetite. The line between superstition and instinct blurred. What doctors dismissed as peasant nonsense sometimes saved more lives than university medicine. These practices also gave people rhythm when life had lost shape. To mix herbs each morning, to say a prayer before sealing the door, it was a small rebellion against chaos. Ritual made fear bearable. Even when neighbors fell one by one, people clung to the repetition of small gestures as if their bodies remembered order when their minds could not. The same psychology echoed in religious life. Bells tolled not only for the dead, but to cleanse the air with sound. Fires were lit in town squares for warmth and purification. Pilgrims carried relics across borders, certain that a saint's bone or a scrap of cloth could shield them. The church blessed these acts because belief itself was a kind of medicine. Despair, after all, killed faster than fever. As the years passed, some of these customs fossilized into tradition. Lavender at windowsills, herbs in kitchens, spring cleaning before Easter, echoes of plague habits disguised as piety. What began as survival became culture. Even the phrase fresh air gained moral weight, as if cleanliness itself were holiness. The truth is, these folk remedies did not cure the plague, but they cured something else, helplessness. They gave people a script when the story made no sense. And long after the disease receded, the gestures remained: hang the herbs, air the room, pray for light. They were memories of survival wrapped in scent. Every civilization leaves behind its medicines. Few leave behind their rituals of fear. The Black Death left both, and between them, the faint reminder that when reason collapses, faith in the small and symbolic can still keep a soul alive long enough for the world to begin again. When the Black Death finally loosened its grip, Europe was not the same continent. The survivors stepped out into quiet cities and empty fields, not knowing why they were still alive when so many others were not. There were theories, prayers, and guesses, but mostly there was silence. In truth, survival came down to a mix of instinct, accident, and geography. Luck had chosen its favorites. Some people had been isolated by chance: a farmer snowed in through winter, a widow who avoided crowds out of grief, a traveler delayed by weather. Others lived because their village happened to be far from a trade route, or because the wind blew differently that year. Even diet and blood type may have played a role, though no one could imagine such invisible math. In every generation since, the question remains the same: why them and not us? The survivors did not have the words, but they had pens. Monks, merchants, and chroniclers began to write lists of the dead, accounts of symptoms, prayers for deliverance. Those records are how we know their world at all. From the papal archives in Avignon to the diaries of Florentine notaries, each entry is a fragment of collective trauma. Some are coldly factual dates, numbers, parish names. Others read like confessions. I buried my wife on Tuesday. On Thursday, I buried my son. The act of writing became its own kind of survival. When you could not control death, you could at least count it. Many who documented the plague did not live long enough to finish their work, but what they left behind became the memory of a vanished Europe. Cities that lost half their people still existed in ink. Words, not walls, held the civilization together. Over time, those notes shaped the future more than anyone expected. The records revealed patterns where death Struck hardest when it slowed, how it travelled. Centuries later, scientists used those same data to map the movement of Yersinia pestis. The medieval scribes, terrified and unscientific, became the accidental founders of epidemiology. But not every legacy was written. The plague reshaped the living in quieter ways. Labourers, once invisible, became essential. Fields lay empty. Wages rose. The rigid hierarchy of medieval life cracked under the weight of absence. Peasants demanded payment, mobility, voice. A generation raised among graves built a more restless world, less obedient, more aware of its own mortality. Even faith changed. Some lost it entirely, seeing no mercy in a God who allowed such ruin. Others clung to it harder, building chapels, painting altarpieces, filling cathedrals with frescoes of skeletons, dancing with kings. The dance macabre became Europe's mirror. Death, it said, was democratic. The rich and poor would meet in the same soil. And art, in that bleak aftermath, bloomed strangely. Painters and poets found beauty in impermanence, writing about time and transience, about how quickly joy turns to dust. The Renaissance, often seen as a rebirth, was born partly out of this despair. When you have watched half the world die, you begin to value the living differently. Curiosity replaces fear. Observation replaces superstition. The legacy of the plague is not just in bones and ruins. It is in habits that never quite left us. Washing hands, opening windows, burying waste, treating air and space as things that matter. These gestures became instinct, passed down long after the reason was forgotten. We still clean before spring. We still fear crowds during sickness. We still flinch at invisible threats. It is memory coded into culture. Every epidemic since the Great Plague of London, cholera, influenza has carried echoes of 1,348. Each time, people rediscover the same fragile truth. Survival is not fairness. It is pattern and chance, shaped by small decisions. Who you touch, where you sleep, how soon you stay home. In the end, the Black Death was both an ending and an origin. It ended the medieval world, but it also began a more self-aware one, a world that would question authority, measure data, study air and blood. Humanity learned, painfully, that fear and curiosity are twins. One destroys, the other builds. And so, when we read their records, now the lists, the prayers, the fading ink, we hear a faint, stubborn heartbeat beneath the horror. It says, we were here. We endured. We began again. That was their real cure. Not herbs, not holy water, not even luck, but the refusal to stop writing the story. And so, we circle back to where it all began, a world trembling under the weight of something unseen. The plague stripped away every illusion people had about power, knowledge, and safety, leaving only what was true, that survival is quiet, practical, and sometimes undeserved. The ones who lived were not always the strongest or the smartest. They were the ones who noticed small things, wind direction, distance, cleanliness, stillness, and listened to them. Every rule of modern health, every public measure we now take for granted, was born from that terror. Washing hands, isolating the sick, burning the infected cloth, studying patterns instead of omens. What feels like common sense today was once bought with centuries of confusion and grief. The Black Death did not end humanity. It remade it. Out of death came data. Out of fear came order. And out of silence came a voice that learned, painfully, to ask why, instead of simply praying please. So as we close this story tonight, remember what the survivors left behind, not just ruins or records, but a kind of inheritance, the knowledge that even when the world seems hopeless, people still rebuild. They still clean, plant, write, and hope. The rhythm of life resumes because it must. Thank you for wandering through this history with me. If you're still here, maybe you feel that quiet thread too. That strange comfort in knowing how fragile we have always been and how often we have risen anyway. Until next time, take care of your small corners of the world and keep them clean.